Hello everyone and welcome to History 104. This is Professor Hasselman, and today we're going to be talking about the late Antiquity period of ancient Rome. Kind of the fall of Rome and the rise of Christianity during this time period. So we're going to be looking at this in two separate lectures. The first we're going to talk about crisis and response in the late Antiquity, and then we're going to focus on barbarians and emperors. And then in the next lecture, after this one, we're going to talk about the emergence of the Catholic Church and Christian culture that developed in the late Antiquity. Now, this lecture is going to open with a series of several others in which we explore the period from about 300 to about 700. To the extent that it has been thought about at all, this is a period when the Roman Empire fell, and when classical antiquity suffered a civilizational collapse and succumbed to the forces of chaos and barbarism, which became the Dark Ages. Now, Hollywood journalists and high school history books may still speak that way, but specialists in the period that is now called late Antiquity, and has been for about 2 generations, take a very different view. The traditional view owes much to Renaissance humanists, about whom we will say more about as we go along, but also to Edward Gibbon in his masterpiece, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Gibbon sought internal and external reasons for Rome's fall. Now, Gibbon spoke of Rome's immoderate greatness. Basically, he meant that the empire was too large, too complex to be kept together for much longer. Gibbon also said that Rome succumbed to barbarism and superstition. He meant by the former, the barbarians, of barbarian invasions fame, which we'll meet later in this lecture, and by the latter, Christianity. Now, historians still speak of internal and external forces in Rome's transformation. But the critical point is that today, specialists speak of transformation of continuity and change working in tandem, of slow, sometimes almost imperceptible alterations in old age patterns of life. Historians are generally suspicious of any theory that claims direct, abrupt, wholesale, and calamitous change. And there's always been the interesting problems of just what fall is supposed to mean. Is it a civilizational catastrophe? Is it the collapse of a political regime? Or is it a change in the basic conditions of life for the great mass of people? Now, in this lecture, we'll look closely at selected aspects of the history of the Roman regime itself. Our starting point must be the crisis of the 3rd century. The Roman world experienced one long period of civil wars, usurpations, and violent transfers of power. The army made and unmade emperors with disconcerting regularity. The contradictions implicit in despotic magistracy had come home to roost, and the empire, which had ceased expanding in the time of Trajan, now began to feel challenges along its frontiers, especially along the Rhine-Danube frontier in the north and in Mesopotamia. The Roman economy was spiraling into deeper and deeper inflation, with irregularly rising prices and falling wages. The prosperity of the Pax Romana was gone. Everywhere there's evidence of a lack of confidence. A sense of gloom and dread pervades literature. Wills and temple prayers are full of angst, and private contributions to public buildings stopped almost completely. Now, at this critical juncture, Rome found 2 rulers who, in nearly a half century of rule, addressed the problems of the 3rd century and put Rome on sound footings. But they also changed the empire fundamentally. And here's one theme we must pursue: the degree in which Rome managed her own transformation. So our first emperor we're going to look at is Diocletian, who lived from 284, or ruled from 284 to 305. And he came from a poor Dalmatian family and rose through the military. He was clever, decisive, and an astute judge of the problems faced by his world. In 293, he introduced the Tetrarchy, or rule by 4. He chose a colleague as Augustus, and this was now a title and not a name as before, and he also assigned each Augustus a subordinate Caesar, again a title. So we have the Augusti and the Caesars. Now, the idea was to provide more rulers with authority in the huge and challenged empire, and to provide for more orderly succession. Now, over the course of this reign, Diocletian reorganized the provincial administration of the empire. He more than doubled the number of provinces by carving large ones into smaller ones. and he dramatically increased the size of the imperial administration from a few hundred to about 30 to 40,000. And he created overarching administrative structures, prefectures, and dioceses. These were governed by prefects and masters of the soldiers chosen by the Augusti. Now, aside from extending the administration, he significantly expanded the size of the Roman army. His aim seems to have been to double the standing army from about 300,000 to 600,000 men, but he probably never got more than 450,000. Rome was faced with the terrible problem of long, exposed frontiers. Now, hoping to get some control of inflation, Diocletian froze prices, wages, and occupations. He accentuated 3rd century trends towards a more despotic form of rule, pompous titles, elaborate courtly ceremonies, and so on, many of which were borrowed from Persia. Historians often speak of a shift from the principate, or the ruler as princeps or first citizen, to the dominate, or the ruler or as dominus, lord and master. Now, true to his ideals, Diocletian retired in 305 to his magnificent palace at Split. The Tetrarchy did not, however, provide for an orderly transmission of power. There was a brief, sharp civil war that saw Constantine, a soldier whose roots were in Britain, come on top, although he continued struggling against rivals for 2 decades. Now, Constantine continued the work and policies of Diocletian. He extended the military reforms of Diocletian, and who had himself built on some precedents of his predecessors. He generalized the use of mobile field armies. These were armies stationed inside the provinces, back behind the frontiers, where they could respond effectively to incursions. And this changed Roman strategy from a relatively static line of defense to defense in depth. Frontiers were left to inferior auxiliary forces and to barbarian allies called federates, because they had concluded a fidus, or a treaty, with Rome. Now, at one time the army had been a path to citizenship, but in 212 the government had granted citizenship to almost everyone in the empire, largely to tax them. Therefore, military service was now attractive to foreigners living along the frontiers. Constantine issued the solidus with a constant weight of gold, and this remained the basic money of account in the Roman world for a millennium. This reform eased but could not end the rampant inflation. Now, Constantine refounded the old Athenian colony of Byzantium and named it after himself, Constantine's Polis, or Constantinople, Istanbul today. This move took some of the prestige away from Rome. However, emperors had rarely ruled from Rome since the 2nd century, and Diocletian's tetrarchy had foreseen rulers in several places. Now, these reforms sensibly addressed the 3rd century crisis, but they also altered the Roman regime forever and provided a stable framework for even more challenges. Now, the Roman world became an armed camp. People lived with soldiers, in their midst as never before. The fiscal apparatus of the state was now more intrusive and extracted more and more money for military causes. Political stability was achieved, but at a price. Because familial loyalties could not be overcome, Rome was governed by a combination of the tetrarchal and dynastic systems. The army still mattered a great deal in politics. The roles of barbarian military officers grew greater and greater, but they did not seek the throne, but were often the power behind it. The increasingly intrusive Roman government damaged Rome's historic ties with local elites who were less loyal to the regime and more loyal to their particular localities. Now, increasingly, the courts in the east and west were rivals and reacted differently to their challenges. Threats posed by barbarians along the Danube frontier induced the government at Constantinople to move those barbarians to the west, and as a result of sheer bad luck, the west rarely had a competent political or military leadership after 395, whereas the east had a number of extremely gifted rulers. It should be clear then that Rome responded creatively and effectively to the challenges that the empire faced. Yet, by 500, the Western Empire was gone, even at the East, as the Eastern survived for another 1,000 years. To understand how this happened, we're going to turn into more detail to those barbarians we've been talking about. Now, to open up our discussion of the barbarians, let's pose a series of questions. What or who is a barbarian? Earlier, we learned that to the Greeks, barbarians were babblers, people who did not speak Greek. The Romans adopted and adapted this point of view. Barbarians were those who lived outside the empire. Naturally, the word had negative connotations, but it was not fundamentally a cultural concept. What are we to make of the Cecil B. DeMille Cast of Thousands picture of the barbarian invasions? Surely this is one of the most familiar images of the late Roman world. The Romans knew, traded with, made treaties with, fought with, and spied on the barbarians for centuries. Right away, we must get rid of all ideas about surprise. We can say that the barbarians were primarily Germanic peoples, that is, people who spoke Germanic languages. And we must be careful to avoid seeing them as the direct ancestors of today's Germans. Now, there was no single coordinated barbarian invasions. The Romans and barbarians did not face each other like teams at the kickoff for a football game. There were 1,000 incidents, all of which demand individual explanation. Now, the Romans wrote about tribes, and many moderns have been duped into following them, but in fact, the various peoples formed, unformed, and reformed many times. The peoples who entered into the history of the late Roman world were polyethnic confederations. Now, we can assign a coherent history to peoples only after they entered the Roman Empire, wherever it was and why it was that they did so. The barbarians were not nomads. They were settled agriculturalists, and therefore, whenever we find any group of them on the move, we need to explain this movement, not attribute it to migratory habits. What is at stake in our discussion? Now, as we saw in the last lecture, Diocletian reorganized the Roman administration. In, say, 300, the western half of the Roman Empire consisted of several dozen provinces. In, say, 600, that Roman Empire was gone in the west, and in its place were several barbarian kingdoms. And we need to assess the relative roles of the Romans and the barbarians in this transformation. Now, a case study of the Visigoths will help us to understand the dynamics of the late Roman world. But remember, we could, for a full understanding, would have to make case studies of a couple of dozens of peoples. The people whom we later known as the Visigoths were a loose confederation living along the central Danube in the early 4th century, when Constantine made a treaty with them, assigning them responsibility for guarding a stretch of the river. In the 370s, some of the Visigoths formally requested permission from the Roman government to cross the Danube and enter the Balkans. They were being hard-pressed by the Huns, who really were nomadic and who had come on the scene a generation or so earlier in the Black Sea region. The government had just experienced a dynamic struggle and had lost an emperor in battle with the Persians in Mesopotamia. Rome had admitted modest-sized groups before, but had tended to disperse them in the military. A request for a large number of people to enter the empire en bloc was unprecedented. Now, thinking themselves loyal allies and fearful of the Huns, the Visigoths crossed the Danube in 376 and immediately began negotiating to regularize their status. They wanted land to settle on and farm. The government panicked, and the Emperor Valens marched north with a small army which the Goths defeated thoroughly at Adrianople in 378. Now, the Emperor Theodosius came to the east and pacified the situation. Now, after Theodosius' death in 395, his sons ruled, one in the east and one in the west. They were bitter rivals, and the Goths, meanwhile, continued to press for a generous landed settlement and now began asking for a Roman military command for their king. Basically, it was during these years that a gaggle, or so to speak, of peoples, some of whom were ethnically Goths, became the Visigoths. Now, at the opening of the 5th century, the Goths, tiring of being pawns in Roman politics, entered Italy. They threatened Rome, then in 410 put the city to the sack. Now, this seemed a cataclysmic event to some people, but the Visigoths were only trying to bring maximum pressure to bear on the Romans. The Visigoths marched north through Italy into southern Gaul. They settled around Toulouse and continued to request recognition. In 418, the Romans accorded the Goths a new treaty, and they were settled under the king in Gaul and assigned responsibility for protecting Gaul's western coasts against the pirates, suppressing brigandage, and guarding the Pyrenees frontier. There was now a kingdom on Roman soil amidst the Roman provinces. A barbarian people were acting on behalf of the Roman government, but were nevertheless largely autonomous. Now, it's hard to see this as an invasion. Clearly, Roman policy had as much to do with all of this as anything the Goths did. Now, a brief look at the ongoing situation in Gaul shows further developments. An allied people called the Burgundians were living in the Savoy region in Gaul and began to press to the north. The Roman military commander in Gaul, Aetius, had grown up among Goths and Huns, and he decided to try to use the Huns as mercenaries against the Burgundians. Now, the Huns realized the tenuousness of the Roman position and began widespread depredations in Gaul. Now, Aetius put together a coalition consisting chiefly of Visigoths and Franks, which defeated the Huns in 451. Now, contemporary sources called Aetius's forces Romans. In 476, the pathetic Romulus Augustulus was deposed, and a barbarian general sent his imperial insignia to Constantinople, saying that the West no longer needed its own emperor, but would carry on under Constantinople's authority. Now, if there was a fall of the Roman Empire, that was all it was. By 500, the former province or western provinces of the empire had changed into several kingdoms, the Frankish kingdom in northern Gaul and central Gaul, the Visigothic kingdom in southern Gaul, but they were about to be defeated by the Franks and driven into Spain, where they persisted until 711. A Burgundian kingdom in east central Gaul, but this kingdom would be absorbed by the Franks, an Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy that would collapse amidst attacks by Roman forces sent by Constantinople. The Ostrogoths were followed in Italy by the Lombards. A Vandal kingdom in North Africa was also defeated by Roman forces. Now, Rome had pulled its troops out of Britain between 370 and 410. What would happen in Britain was not yet clear in 500. Historian Walter Goffart has said that Rome's experience of accommodating the barbarians was an imaginative experiment that got a little out of hand. Historian Patrick Geary has called the barbarian kingdoms Rome's last creative act. So this is the end of today's lecture, and hopefully you enjoyed learning a little bit about some of the barbarians that moved throughout the Roman Empire and whether or not we would consider these an invasion or not. And we also learned about the development of late antiquity of the ancient Rome. Now in the next lecture, we're going to be talking about the emergence of the Catholic Church and Christian culture during late antiquity. So this is the end of today's lecture in History 104. I hope you learned something today and enjoyed the discussion, and I look forward to speaking to you next time.